Let God be true and every man a liar. No king but Jesus reigns over the righteous. These words aren't just a bold declaration. They are a reminder of something deeply rooted in the human soul. The belief that no matter how powerful a person may seem, there is a higher authority that no crown or title can replace. Earthly rulers may claim control. They may demand allegiance. They may pass laws, build armies, or create fear. But they cannot rule the heart, and they cannot own the soul. But that space belongs to God alone. There's something powerful about knowing that our dignity, our worth, and our calling don't come from political systems or public approval. They come from the one who made us. The message behind no king but Jesus is not just religious. It's a declaration of freedom. It's the refusal to bow to anything or anyone that tries to take God's place, whether it's a corrupt government, a manipulative leader, or a society that worships status and wealth. The truth remains, if it doesn't serve righteousness, it holds no true power. This is not about disobedience for the sake of defiance. It's about remembering that no man, no institution, no movement can ever replace the moral compass given by God. History shows us again and again when leaders try to take divine authority into their own hands, injustice follows. Tyranny grows. But when people suffer, rise with the understanding that their highest allegiance belongs to truth, to compassion, to justice, then real change begins. This divine authority is not about force or fear. It doesn't come with guns or golden thrones. It comes with love, with truth, with quiet conviction that cannot be bribed, silenced, or shaken. The phrase, every man a liar, doesn't mean we hate humanity. It means we recognize our limits. We acknowledge that people can be flawed, selfish, or wrong. That's why we don't put blind trust in humans. We put our faith in something higher, someone who never changes, who always judges with fairness, and who sees every heart fully. This is why movements like 5001 exist. Not because people crave conflict, but because they crave truth. They rise when something inside them says, this is not right. And they stand not in pride, but in obedience to a higher calling. But the authority of God doesn't make us violent. It makes us brave. It makes us walk away from fear. It makes us protect the weak, always speak for the voiceless, and refuse to worship at the feet of false kings. At the end of the day, no leader, no system, no force on earth should ever have the final say over who we are or what we stand for. That power belongs to God and to God alone. The 5001 movement didn't erupt from rage. It rose from conscience. It wasn't fueled by chaos, but by clarity. By millions of people across the country didn't step out of their homes to create division. They did it to reclaim their voice, to stand for something deeper than politics, and to say with one heart, we still believe in justice, truth, and freedom. What made this movement powerful wasn't noise, it was purpose. People didn't march because they hated a person or a party. They marched because something inside them whispered, this isn't right, and I can't stay silent anymore. That's the difference between rebellion and responsibility. True conscience doesn't need fire to destroy. It carries fire to light the way. The protests weren't about tearing down. It was about lifting up a higher standard. Across cities and towns, people came together, not to fight each other, but to remind the world what matters. Dignity, fairness, and truth. There was no thirst for revenge. There was no pleasure in pointing fingers. There was only a shared conviction that silence was no longer an option. You could see it in the quiet strength of a mother walking in hand in hand with her child. You could hear it in the voices singing hymns, by reading scripture or holding signs with messages of peace and courage. You could feel it in the atmosphere. Tense, yes, but grounded. It was not an uprising of destruction. It was an uprising of awakened hearts. A call to return to something honest, something moral, so something sacred. This kind of movement doesn't rely on the latest headline. It's not driven by trends or hashtags. It's driven by people who carry conviction in their bones. And these are people who've been watching for years, hoping things would get better, waiting for someone to lead with integrity. And when that didn't happen, they realized the leadership must begin with us. Not from a throne, not from a press conference, but from the soul of the people who still care. It's easy to label any protest chaos. It's convenient to reduce crowds to anger. But the Fado Pfizer One movement wasn't built on anger. It was built on love for country, love for truth, and love for future generations. People were not asking for perfection. They were asking for honesty. They were asking for leaders who serve, not rule. For systems that protect, not exploit. And while many tried to silence them, mislabel them, or discredit them, the truth is undeniable. This was one of the most widespread, but organized, peaceful displays of conscience in modern history. When conscience wakes up, it doesn't scream, it stands. And that's exactly what happened. So when they say it was rebellion, we say it was responsibility. When they say it was chaos, we say it was clarity, because what moved the people wasn't hate, it was hope. And that's a force no lie can ever drown. There comes a time when people can no longer ignore the weight of corruption pressing down on their lives. There comes a moment when silence feels like betrayal. With the 55 Pfizer One movement, it was born in that moment. A moment when people looked around and saw leadership that no longer served the people, but only served itself. It was not just disappointment. It was a deep awareness that something sacred had been violated. That leaders who were supposed to protect were now demanding obedience. That instead of humility, there was arrogance. Instead of service, there was control. The movement became a loud and unified no to the kind of leadership that thrives on ego, but lies and greed. It was a direct rejection of power that bullies instead of builds, that manipulates instead of ministers. The people were no longer willing to pretend that those wearing crowns of pride had earned the right to lead. They had seen too much, too many promises broken, too many rights trampled, too many lives harmed, while those in charge smiled and celebrated themselves. And so they rose not with hatred, but with resolve. Now, not to destroy, but to say, this is not leadership, and we will no longer follow it. False kings don't always wear robes or sit on thrones. Sometimes they appear as politicians, billionaires, influencers, or institutions that operate like empires. What they have in common is a hunger for control and an excitation of submission. But righteousness cannot be forced, trust cannot be demanded, and true authority cannot be built on injustice. The people saw through the illusion, but they saw that flashy titles and polished speeches mean nothing when they're used to cover up abuse of power. They realized that the system was being twisted, that those in power were not being held accountable, and that truth had been replaced with propaganda. So they stood, not to tear down what is good, but to strip away what is false. They didn't rise up to replace one king with another. They rose to say, we are not subjects, we are citizens. And our loyalty does not belong to rulers who lie, exploit, or divide. It belongs to truth. It belongs to justice. It belongs to something higher than human power. This rejection of false leadership wasn't about one person. It was about an entire system that rewards arrogance and punishes humility. A culture where strength is measured by dominance, and where serving the people is treated like weakness. The movement cried out for a different way, for leadership that listens, for accountability, for honor, and for leaders who remember that their power is not a privilege, it's a responsibility. When the people said, "No king but Jesus," they were saying something powerful. But we will not be ruled by those who act like gods, but live without grace. We will not bow to power that is empty of truth. But we will not surrender to any system that demands submission without righteousness. Something powerful happens when people remember who they are, not just as voters or citizens, but as human beings created with purpose, dignity, and a voice that matters. The 5001 movement was more than a political response. It was a spiritual and civic awakening. It wasn't just about changing laws or resisting power. It was about waking up from a deep sleep of silence and compromise. It was about people feeling the weight of their conscience again, about hearing that still, small voice within that says, "You were made for more than this." Across the country, from cities to small towns, a shift began. It wasn't led by politicians or media figures. It came from ordinary people who had enough. People who had been watching, grieving, praying, and hoping, and then something in them sparked. They looked around and saw injustice, lies, and fear being used as tools of control, and they knew they couldn't stay quiet any longer. This was the moment when silence became too costly, when apathy was no longer an option. What began was not just a protest. It was a reawakening of conscience. This awakening was deeply spiritual because at its core it was a return to truth. People began to ask, who really has authority over my life? Who do I follow? Who do I trust? And the answer came not from the systems of power, but from something eternal. From the belief that we are accountable not to men who hunger for control, but to God who calls us to righteousness. That truth matters more than convenience. That love is stronger than fear. And that faith must move beyond words into action. The movement brought people together in ways politics never could. Neighbors who had never spoken stood side by side. Strangers became allies. Communities once divided by ideology were suddenly united by shared values, honesty, justice, mercy, and hope. This was not the kind of unity you force with laws. It was the kind that grows when hearts are aligned, when people realize they are not alone in what they feel, when they see that others carry the same burden, the same longing for something better, something sacred. It also awakened civic responsibility. People who had never been involved before started organizing, speaking, voting, and showing up, not because someone told them to, but because they felt called to. The movement didn't give them a script. It gave them courage. It didn't give them power. It reminded them they already had it. And with that courage, they stood, not with violence, but with truth, not with hatred, but with hope. This awakening can't be undone. It can't be bought or silenced. It's not a moment, it's a shift. Once people remember their worth, their voice, and their purpose, and they cannot unsee what they've seen, and they cannot go back to sleep. Something eternal has been stirred, and it's only just beginning. Peaceful defiance is not weakness. It is strength under control. It is the choice to stand when it would be easier to run, to speak truth when silence would feel safer. When the 5001 movement embodied this truth, it was not about creating chaos. It was about standing in truth, and refusing to participate in lies. It was a movement deeply rooted in faith, not fear. People didn't take to the streets because they were angry and reckless. They did it because they believed in something higher, something sacred, something unshakable. They believed in divine justice. And they knew that when justice is ignored, the righteous must rise, not with fists, but with conviction. This kind of defiance confuses the world, because it doesn't look like a aggression. It looks like dignity. It looks like people praying as they march, singing while they stand, crying while they remain peaceful, even in the face of hostility. There were no weapons in their hands, only truth in their hearts. And truth is powerful. Truth pierces lies without raising a sword. Truth exposes injustice without setting fires. When the people rose, they weren't trying to destroy, they were refusing to bow. And that refusal was not loud or angry. It was calm, firm, and deeply spiritual. Their resistance was backed by something the world can't manufacture: moral authority. It wasn't about gaining power, it was about protecting the soul of the nation. These weren't just political protests. They were moments of spiritual clarity. People recognized that when the law serves the powerful and oppresses the weak, when leaders demand loyalty without accountability, when truth is manipulated for control, then obedience becomes complicity. And conscience must act. But that action doesn't have to be violent. In fact, real courage often shows up in restraint. In choosing peace when you have every reason to lash out. In staying grounded when the ground beneath you is shaking. Faith gave the movement its strength. Not faith in systems or parties or leaders, but faith in God. Faith that light will overcome darkness, that justice will not sleep forever, that righteousness still matters. People stood not because they were certain of the outcome, but because they were certain of what was right. They were willing to lose comfort, approval, even safety, because truth was worth it, and because their peace didn't come from the world. It came from the one who promises peace in the storm. This peaceful defiance was not passive. It was bold. It said, we will not bow. We will not hate, but we also will not move. And in that stillness, in that calm resistance, a different kind of power rose up. A power that cannot be silenced, bought, or crushed. A power that comes from truth lived out, faith held tightly, and justice carried gently but boldly. That is what made this movement unbreakable. And that is why it continues to echo long after the crowds have gone home. There is a kind of unity that can't be forced, bought, or manufactured. It doesn't come from agreement on every issue or following the same party line. It comes from something much deeper: shared purpose, a shared truth, and a shared refusal to accept lies any longer. That's what made the 505, 501 movement so powerful. It wasn't just a protest. It was a gathering of people from all walks of life who realized they had more in common than they thought. They weren't just united by frustration. They were united by purpose, by a deep, clear understanding of who they are, what they believe, and what they will no longer accept. The speech that echoed through the movement's heart wasn't just about resistance. It was about identity. The people are awake. The people are free. And they will never again bow to false kings. Those words didn't come from arrogance. They came from clarity. A clarity that rises when the fog of manipulation lifts. When fear no longer controls the narrative. When people stop waiting for permission to speak and finally realize the power of their collective voice. That unity didn't need uniforms or slogans. It was written on faces, heard in chants. and felt in the silence that followed every step taken in peace. People knew why they were there. They weren't looking to belong to another movement. They were reclaiming who they already were, citizens with dignity. Human beings with rights. People created not to serve power, but to hold it accountable. That shared identity gave them strength, and that strength gave them direction. This wasn't just political unity, it was moral unity. A gathering of people who understood that truth is not subjective, negative when it comes to justice. That oppression is never acceptable, no matter who is in charge. And that bowing to any leader who operates without accountability or compassion is not loyalty, it is surrender. The people chose to stand, and they stood together. Not perfectly, not always neatly, but with a fire that no king, no party, no institution could extinguish. What made this unity unshakable was that it wasn't built on personality. It was built on conviction. It wasn't fragile because it didn't depend on one voice. It was carried by thousands, even millions, each one adding their courage to something bigger than themselves. The people had woken up, and once you're awake, you can't pretend not to see. Once you've tasted freedom, not just the kind promised in speeches, but the kind that lives in the soul, you refuse to hand it over again. This was the turning point, the moment when the people said, enough. The moment when unity didn't mean sameness but strength. The people stood side by side, not because they were the same, but because they knew the same truth. Their freedom was not given by kings, and it would not be taken by them. We were not made to kneel before men who crowned themselves. We were made to stand in truth, walk in faith, and rise together. The people have spoken, and we will never bow to false kings again. Let God be true and every man a liar. No king but Jesus reigns over the righteous. These words aren't just a bold declaration. They are a reminder of something deeply rooted in the human soul. The belief that no matter how powerful a person may seem, there is a higher authority that no crown or title can replace. Earthly rulers may claim control. They may demand allegiance. They may pass laws, build armies, or create fear. But they cannot rule the heart, and they cannot own the soul. But that space belongs to God alone. There's something powerful about knowing that our dignity, our worth, and our calling don't come from political systems or public approval. They come from the one who made us. The message behind no king but Jesus is not just religious. It's a declaration of freedom. It's the refusal to bow to anything or anyone that tries to take God's place.